Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're putting two heavyweights of the cloud database world head to head. Amazon Aurora versus Microsoft's Azure database for MySQL. Look, if you're building anything in the cloud, you've probably stared at this exact choice. It's a huge deal. It affects your app's speed, your bill, pretty much everything. So how do you even begin to decide? Let's get into it.
Okay, so before we start picking them apart, let's just take a step back. Why are we even talking about managed services like these? What's the big idea they both share?
Well, the big promise for both is pretty simple. They take away all the database grunt work. Think about patching, backups, scaling, all that tedious stuff you don't want to deal with. Both services handle that for you. It frees you up to actually focus on building your app, not babysitting a database. And this is where things get really interesting. We're talking about two totally different philosophies, two fundamentally different designs. And you really need to get this part because everything else we talk about, performance, cost, all of it, stems right from here.
So on one side, you've got Amazon Aurora. AWS basically ripped MySQL down to the studs and rebuilt it from scratch specifically for the cloud. Then you have Azure. Microsoft took a totally different path. They said, let's give people the MySQL they already know and love, but just make it better by running it in the cloud. Two completely different ways of thinking.
Let's dig into Aurora's design. Here's the magic trick. It separates the database brain from the storage. Instead of writing big, chunky blocks of data over the network, Aurora just sends these tiny little redo log records, which are basically just notes saying, hey, this little thing changed. This is its secret sauce. It cuts down network traffic like you wouldn't believe, and that's key to its performance claims. And that special storage layer, it's also what makes Aurora so incredibly tough. Get this. Your data is copied that's right, 6 times across 3 different physical locations. A write is considered done as soon as just 4 of those copies say, we got it. This means you can literally lose an entire data center plus another server, and your data is still safe. That is resilience on a massive scale. Now let's flip over to Azure's philosophy, straight from the horse's mouth. The key words to notice here are granular control and flexibility. See, Microsoft isn't trying to reinvent the database engine. Their whole game is about giving developers and DBAs the kind of control they're used to, just with all the awesome perks of being in the cloud. All right, time for the main event, performance. This is where the story gets really fun, because depending on who you ask and what you measure, you get very different answers. So in AWS's own benchmarks, where they focus purely on slamming the database with writes, Aurora is an absolute monster. Its cloud-native architecture just shines. You can see the performance just scales up in a beautiful, straight line as you give it more power, hitting levels way beyond standard MySQL. But, and this is a huge but, that's not the whole story. A write-only test isn't what most real-world apps do. So what happens when you run a benchmark that looks a little more like a typical application? Well, the story changes a lot. Check this out. In this test, simulating a mixed read and write workload, Azure Database for MySQL actually pulled ahead. It processed more transactions every second and did it with slightly lower latency compared to Aurora. Now, for full transparency, and this is super important, this report was commissioned by Microsoft. That doesn't make the results wrong, but context is everything. You should always know who's paying for the benchmark when you're looking at these kinds of claims. Okay, what about when things go wrong? How quickly can you recover? Here, Aurora's unique architecture really pays off. Because that storage is shared, promoting a backup replica to take over is crazy fast, often under 30 seconds. Azure is also highly available, for sure, but its failover is more traditional and can take a little bit longer. So, we've covered the architecture and the performance, but now let's get into the other stuff that really drives a decision. Features, how well it plays with your existing code, and of course, the cost. This little table really shows Azure's focus on flexibility. For example, they offer high availability inside the same zone, which is something Aurora doesn't. They also push hard on having an easy migration path from standard MySQL. And a big one, especially if you're just starting out, Azure has a free tier. Aurora does not. And this right here might be the most crucial point of all. Azure runs this standard open-source community version of MySQL, the one everybody knows. Aurora runs a custom proprietary version that is MySQL compatible. That word compatible is key. It's not identical. If your app relies on some weird specific feature of MySQL, you absolutely have to test it on Aurora first.
Now let's talk about the bill. How you use your database will have a massive impact on what you pay. If your app has really spiky traffic, super busy then super quiet, Aurora Serverless can be a game changer since it can scale all the way down to 0. But if your workload is nice and steady, Azure's more traditional, predictable pricing might be a better fit for your budget.
And remember that Microsoft-funded study? They also crunched the numbers on price versus performance. And in that specific scenario, they found that Azure delivered the same level of performance for up to 54% less money. Again, it's their test, but that's a pretty compelling argument for their side.
So after all that, which one is better? The answer is, it depends. It totally depends on your priorities. If you need massive read scalability and near-instant failover for a critical application, Aurora's cloud-native design is probably your best bet. But if what you value most is maximum compatibility with the open-source MySQL you already know, more granular control, and predictable costs, then Azure is likely the right fit. Ultimately, it's not about which one wins. It's about which architecture is right for your app.